I don't know what's worse. The screams that ended a few weeks ago, or the silence that has fallen since then. Before, I felt like everything should be done to help others. Now, in my self-reflection, I just don't know anymore. It was like any other day in the city. Sunny, crowded and busy. I was walking to work at a large national bank, where I recently began an internship. I remember the day well because, besides the obvious fact that the world ended on this day, I'd finally convinced myself to talk to the cute secretary across the hall from me. Things just seemed to be going my way that day. I walked to work every day, and the flow of traffic was straight my way. That's when the alarm sounded. There was a mass panic, as is expected. I watched as thousands of people ran in hysteria, all going absolutely nowhere. Some of the people ran for the subways, anything deep in the ground. Now, there's only so many places to go, and, as I stated before, people weren't getting very far. The only option I really had was to follow all those going into the subways. There were some military personnel in the corridor, instructing us down the tunnel, wearing full military gas suits, like they were equipped for some sort of bio-air attack. You couldn't see their faces at all, and they looked ominous. Some people were crying, and the children were screaming as their parents dragged them into the ever-darkening tunnel. It must have been a few hours that I walked in darkness with crowds of people before more military personnel, dressed in similar attire as described before, signalled us to turn left into a behemoth of a vault. The characters N77, R2D, 80F were written across some of the steelwork. I was lucky enough to have gotten in because I heard gunshots after walking through the metal frames and the large bronze doors were shut behind us. More screams could be heard outside and more gunshots. Things got quiet outside after a few minutes. The explosions began around 15 minutes later. The sound was deafening, and the ground shook like the gods themselves were trying to kill us. The children continued to scream through it all, and continued long after. The thing that disturbed me the most was the lack of noise outside. Things remained quiet in the vault for the next few days. People talked about what it was that might have happened on the outside. And the general consensus was that a nuclear explosion had detonated on the surface. It was a miracle that we were all still alive, to be honest. There was a small cafeteria for us, but it was obviously overwhelmed by the amount of refugees here. The food rations were fairly small and seemed inhumane, though we all knew there wasn't enough to go around. It was around the third or fourth day that noises began to come from outside the vault. The soldiers were instructed by their superiors not to open the doors for any reason, and I think we were all thankful for it. None of us wanted to see what was on the other side, especially now when we heard their pleas.
We know you're in there. You have to let us in. Help us. We're dying out here. Do something. For the love of God, help.
Their cries went on for around 3 hours before gunshots sounded on the other side of the door. Oh, I don't want to know who those shots came from, but we were all glad for the quiet. After a week more, the voices were back. This time, they cursed and threatened us all on the inside. They went on to say that once they were on the inside, they'd eat our flesh and suck the marrow from our bones like a straw. I tried not to let it get to me, but it wasn't working. The voices followed me into my dreams and caused me horrible nightmares. I dreamt I was on the outside in the probably leveled city, being chased by subhumans trying to eat me. I know they're just dreams, but who knows if that's too far off from reality. Recently, the leaders of the vault had all agreed that our rations would be halved. There was protest, and a small faction tried to take the cafeteria, but they were all shot. I've begun hoarding the food I've gotten in my bag for work. Like I said, there's not a lot, but I stow away what I can, when I can. They're inside the vault now, and they're not human. I caught a glimpse of them as I ran through the corridors, and those things are not humans. They have horrible green glowing eyes, and their hairless skin is yellow. I locked eyes with one of them. In that moment, I felt the hatred heave. It felt for me. A step, 2 steps, and then finally a burst of rounds into his head from his left. I didn't stop to wait and greet my savior. No, I ran. I ran as fast and as hard as I could run. You'll probably think me a coward for what I'm about to say next, but I don't care. I arrived in the cafeteria and went straight for the kitchen. Breakfast was being served, so one of the storerooms wasn't locked up, and no one was around. I locked the giant door behind me and listened to the carnage outside my door. Some shots continued to ring throughout the next couple of hours, and then was silenced. I spent my time taking stock of what food I had, and it was enough to survive for, let's just say, a hell of a long time. A soldier lay inside, near the door, with his rifle to his front, and his sidearm still holstered. I grabbed the sidearm and pocketed it. I've been in this room for longer than I can keep track. By the amount of cans stacked against the wall, I can guess a month or so. The corpse in the room began to rot a long time ago, and the stench is horrendous. It fills my nostrils day and night. The worst of it is, they know I'm here. They know I've locked myself in this room, and they keep telling me I'm going to die here. I'm going to die in this room. This is the place. They whisper to me in my sleep that they'll peel my eyelids off of my head and rip my fingers off one by one. I spend the days curled up in the corner, watching the man rot, wishing my hell would end. I've thought to myself many times that I could just shoot myself in the temple, and then this nightmare would go away. The food is dwindling, and the idea is more and more tempting. Those hollow things call my name. In my loneliness, I told them who I was. They tell me to open the door, and it'll all those hollow, inhuman things tell me to end it. End the torture on my own terms. They got one thing right. Tomorrow, when I wake up, I'm ending it on my own terms. She stalked the dark hallways of the school, making sure that she made no unnecessary sounds that would attract anyone. She'd been following her math teacher for a few minutes now, and was positive that she'd seen him wander into the school building. She checked her watch. She had about an hour to the curfew. The school was deserted, as it had been for the last summer month. She was being extra cautious. She didn't want anyone seeing her follow her teacher into the school. That could only bring trouble. She followed her teacher into the dark hallways. Her teacher seemed to be wandering aimlessly, oblivious to his following. She waited for him to move into someplace quieter, so she could make her move. Finally, her teacher stopped in front of the bathroom, probably intrigued by the sound of rumbling pipes, and slowly made his way inside. Perfect, she muttered to herself as she reached around for her pink backpack and withdrew a bloodied, solid lead pipe from within and made her way into the bathroom. She carefully closed the bathroom door behind her and ever so softly turned the lock. The soft clink of the lock made her teacher turn around to face her. She could see the look of confusion in the old man's eyes. She followed his gaze to the lead pipe in her hands and watched as his face contorted into a hideous snarl as he lunged towards her. A smile forming on her lips, she sidestepped and drove the pipe with all her might into the back of his head with a sickening thump. She watched him crash into the floor. Soon enough, a pool of dark blood formed around his head. She had done this way more often than she cared to admit. As her math teacher lay on the white tiled bathroom floor, twitching uncontrollably from the skull bashing he'd just received a few seconds earlier, she stood over him, her feet on either side of his waist. She looked him right in the eye and said, "This is for the C- on my last paper," and drove the pipe into his skull again, finishing him. As she wiped blood and brains from the lead pipe, the walkie-talkie in her backpack crackled.
Bulldog, this is Base. What's your status? Over.
Base, this is Bulldog. The school is clear. I repeat, the school is clear. Returning to base now. Over and out. As she made her way out of the bathroom, she glanced towards the corpse of her math teacher and muttered to herself, "Man, this zombie apocalypse is stressful." It's been 2 weeks since this whole thing started. It all started with a tanker accident. It was all over the news. Everyone thought it was just another oil spill. There were plenty of volunteers, plenty of people wanting to help the poor, defenseless animals. Plenty of victims. Within hours of the tanker accident, it started happening. The animals had gone crazy. They were scratching and biting the cleanup volunteers. They said it was an adverse effect of whatever was in that tanker. Rescue workers were still trying to get the crew out of the ship. They could hear the screaming inside. There were screams to open the doors, but that's when it all went to hell as soon as they cut the door out. There were 6 minutes of broadcast before it went silent. 6 minutes of screaming and agony. The ship's crew attacked the rescue workers like rabid baboons. They were breaking bones and tearing flesh. The people on the shore weren't faring any better. Those that had been attacked by animals were attacking everyone else. It was worse than any war zone report. It was sheer brutality. And yet the broadcast still went on for 6 minutes. There were 6 minutes, and then blank faces. Nobody could explain what was happening. They tried to continue with the regular news, the economy, the weather, and a cute human interest story. But they couldn't make us unsee what we'd seen. I tried to continue with my regular existence, but every time I switched on the news or walked by a newsstand, it was there, this big mystery. They had some explanation. So, it was an infection, or maybe brain parasites, but it didn't matter. It wasn't the infection we were afraid of. It was them. 4 days after the initial report, a state of emergency was raised. And yet, we've all seen this before. It's in every zombie movie ever. People didn't know who to trust. People were stockpiling food and weapons. Some tried to flee, but it seems every zombie movie was right. They didn't make it. 3 days later, they arrived in my town. I expected moans, shuffling corpses, and dismemberment. But that's where the movies lied. They ran through the streets, screaming. I remember running to my front door as fast as I could, locking, barricading, and doing anything to make sure it would stay shut. And then I headed for the window. I was on the second story and I could see the carnage. They were unstoppable. They were aware. A group of them made their way through a building across the street. They jumped straight through plate glass windows. Even the shards slicing through them made no difference. They just kept coming. My barricade wasn't going to hold. I rushed around my flat, grabbing supplies and jamming them into the most secure room of the apartment. I went back for one last look across the street, and I wish I hadn't. In a second-story window, my face met one of theirs. They knew where I was. I quickly dashed into the room and locked the door. I didn't have any kind of panic room or a secure basement, so the safest place I could think of was my bathroom. There were no windows and only one door. It had a lock. I filled my sink and bathtub full of water so I could stay for a while. I sat there in the dark room with the distant screams in my ears. I began to feel like I may have overreacted. It had been 2 hours with no sign of them. It actually got quieter, and I thought maybe they'd moved on. Maybe I could leave the room and get to the kitchen. I could grab some more food to wait it out. Then, a crash came through the front door. There was the sound of someone running full force into the door and knocking down the barrier behind it. There were a couple more crashes before I knew they were inside. There were rapid footsteps moving around the flat, a couple of screams, and then a bang on the wall beside me. My eyes were open to their widest, even in the pitch-black darkness of the room. There was another bang, and then another. They knew I was there, and they knew I was scared. This was the zombie nightmare I'd been expecting from the start. I had nowhere to run. There was only so much time before they would break in. I sat with my back to the door, hoping my extra weight wouldn't make it harder for them to get in. Then it got worse.
Why don't you open the door?
There was a voice on the opposite side of the door. There were no screams or moans, just a quiet, whispery voice. And then, more of them.
We've come for you. You'll be happier if you open the door.
It's not so bad. The whispery voices became a cacophony of noise, trying to persuade me, to break me, to fool me. I'd heard that the moaning of zombies would drive people insane, but this was worse. A siren call. I sat in the darkness and hoped and prayed that they'd get bored. But they don't get bored, and they don't leave. I managed to use the mirror to peek under the door, only to be greeted by horrible, unblinking eyes, blood-smeared faces, screams, and more horrible whispers. That was 2 days ago.